This is NBC News at this hour.
Hello, everyone. I'm Patty Ann Brown. In the news at this hour, protests in the nation's capital are winding down. Police arrested some 600 people today who were demonstrating against the policies of world financial leaders. Today is the final day of meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. On Wall Street, the bulls overtook the bears for the time being. The Dow closed up more than 276 points and the Nasdaq gained 217. The late-day rally follows record drops in those indicators just 3 days ago. And protesters continue their vigil outside Elian Gonzalez's home in Miami as a federal appeals court weighs the boy's fate. The court is considering whether to suspend an earlier ruling blocking the government from sending Elian back to Cuba. And that's the latest. I'm Patty Ann Brown. Stay tuned. The Mitchell Report is up next.
The siege of Washington. Protests don't stop the World Bank, but the rest of Washington stays home. How is the city handling it? We'll hear from Mayor Anthony Williams. Wall Street's back on the rise, but for how long? The latest on our jittery markets. And the politics of trade and the economy. House Democratic Whip David Bonnier among our guests tonight.
For Monday, April 17th, 2000, this is the Mitchell Report. Now, here's Andrea Mitchell.
Hello and welcome. On a day when torrential rains washed out the centerpiece rally of the Washington protests, and the weatherman was the police department's best friend. A soggy mix of traditional labor and environmental activists with an anarchist fringe from the Seattle riots played cat and mouse with police all day. But security officials outmaneuvered and outnumbered the activists, studying hard the lessons of Seattle.
The protesters were able to voice their concerns. The meetings were able to take place. The police maintained, I thought, extraordinary discipline and control. And I think that we proved that there can be protests and cities don't have to burn.
For the second day, the protesters were not able to stop the World Bank from meeting today. The sessions focused on a global campaign to eradicate AIDS.
One thing is very clear, is that to some segments of the public, we're not getting through. We thought they were preaching to the choir on some of the complaints that they were making. We know that with other sectors of the public, we're having a very constructive dialogue.
If we look at the record of these institutions just in the last couple of years, they've actually caused enormous social and economic destruction in Asia, in Russia, and Brazil. They made the crisis worse with policies like 80% interest rates, which sent the whole regional economy into a tailspin.
Two very different points of view, and protests of another sort in far better weather at Camp Elian, the media encampment in Little Havana. After a weekend of charges and countercharges from the feuding branches of the Gonzalez family, a tense wait for an appeals court ruling that could finally trigger federal action to return Elian to his father. At one point over the weekend, lawyers for Lázaro Gonzalez were speaking simultaneously on 3 separate Sunday talk shows, a feat previously engineered by a single man, one-time Lewinsky lawyer William Ginsburg. And in politics today, George W. is celebrating Tax Day by pushing his tax cut proposal at a campaign stop in Arkansas, part of his post-primary attempt to recast his agenda as more compassionate and more socially active. Al Gore is fresh from a record-setting Hollywood fundraiser this weekend, his first joint appearance with Bill Clinton in months. Apparently disproving the cliche that absence makes the heart grow fonder, Gore offered this ringing endorsement of Clinton's record.
Of all the good things I could say about President Bill Clinton, and I could tell you about the many, many times when I have seen him, especially in the early years, nearly buckle under the pressure of this office, but never do so.
And now to our daily briefing. Today we begin with Alan Murray from the Wall Street Journal Bureau here in Washington. Bureau Chief Alan Murray. Alan, what happened today? We had rebounds on both markets, the Dow leading NASDAQ.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, the markets came back more than 50% of what they lost on Friday, and what you hear from policymakers here in Washington is that it's hard to talk about the effect of this when you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. There's enormous volatility in this market, and you could see it go back to where it was in the middle of last week, or you could see it drop another 500 points. So it's difficult to analyze the situation. I think policymakers are sort of watching and wondering.
So we had the Dow up 216. NASDAQ was up, final numbers, rather the Dow closed 276. The Dow was up, the NASDAQ up 217. When you look at numbers like that, big percentage point increases, what does it tell you about confidence in the fundamentals? And was it Larry Summers over the weekend reassuring people? Were these people just trying to get some bargains?
I think what this tells you is that there is a great deal of confidence in the fundamentals of our economy. Good things are going on. Productivity is increasing. The ability of the economy to grow over the long term is increasing. But that doesn't mean that these high levels of stock valuations that you've seen in the market over the last 12 to 16 months are totally justified. And so the folks in the market are trying to figure out, okay, well, where does the market belong? Where is the market? And then, of course, Andrea, on top of that, you do have these early signs that inflation is starting to come back. Not in the way we had it in the 1970s or even the 1980s, but that at least there's some early signs of building inflation.
What is the political impact of this? Alan, is this kind of volatility going to have some effect on whether Al Gore can still keep bragging about the economy, or does it begin to make people uncertain? And if they are uncertain, do they stick with the tried and true Al Gore, or do they begin to think more about George W. Bush?
Every time Al Gore speaks these days, he talks about this wonderful economy that the Clinton-Gore administration have brought along. It is clearly one of his biggest, if not his biggest, single asset. It means a lot to the Gore campaign. If the market were to take a steep fall and stay there, it could hurt Al Gore. Maybe not a lot, but the point is you're in a very close political race, and it's not going to take a lot to make an important difference.
If things start really slowing down and we go into even a downturn, does George W.'s big tax cut proposal look more credible? Or conversely, do you begin to worry about budget surpluses not materializing and the tax cut is less credible?
Well, I think if you were actually to go into a downturn, then a tax cut might look pretty appealing. But we are a long way away from that, Andrea. I mean, you're talking about growth rates of 5, 6, 7% in recent quarters. So even if you had a substantial slowdown, you'd still have positive growth. One of the interesting things here is that some people think that the sell-off on Friday was prompted, at least in part, by people selling stocks to raise money to pay their capital gains taxes. They had big capital gains on their portfolios last year. Some people maybe were taken by surprise and had to raise money to pay the taxes on that. And yet George Bush's tax plan is one of the first Republican tax plans in a long time that doesn't cut the capital gains tax. He wanted to focus on lower income people, so he didn't cut the capital gains tax, so he can't really take advantage of that.
Alan, when you take a close look at the kinds of things that George W. was proposing today again in Arkansas with the big tax cut, it is a complete departure from traditional Republican economic policy. He's talking about a socially active government, and the government being not just, quote, compassionate, but specifically involved in education, in health, in all sorts of welfare programs. That is a big difference.
I think that's turning out to be the most remarkable aspect of this campaign, is how close these two candidates are. The Vice President Al Gore is very cautious in putting spending plans on the table, and meantime, Governor Bush is putting some, for a Republican, fairly big plans on the table, and so on the spending side, they look fairly close together. Meanwhile, on the tax side, while Governor Bush does have a pretty big tax proposal, it's not the kind of supply-side proposal that you have seen in the past from Republicans, with big cuts in capital gains taxes, big cuts in the marginal tax rate. So you really are finding these two candidates fighting over a pretty narrow piece of territory in the middle of the spectrum.
Now, taking a turn to the protests which have engulfed us this weekend, you're right there at the Wall Street Journal offices in the middle of one of the areas. After you listen to all the rhetoric, and I tried to listen to as many of the speeches as I could on C-SPAN this weekend, how do you come down on the criticism of the IMF and the World Bank, compared to their claim that they are really helping the poor, even though income disparity, despite the growth with globalization, income disparity has widened?
Look, I think the protesters are right in pointing to a 30-year trend of increasing the gap between the rich and the poor, and it's a problem, and it's a problem that needs to be attended to. But a lot of the criticism of the IMF and the bank on this score are really off base and not always terribly coherent. There are a lot of people out there with a lot of different interests. Some of them are worried about sea turtles. Some of them are worried about whales. Some of them worried about oil pipelines. Some of them appear to just be here for a good time. So it's not clear that there is a strong, coherent focus to it. Having said that, they're clearly making an impact. They're getting their time on the evening news. They managed to shut down a significant portion of Washington today, and so I think they're going to make some difference in the debate.
And they've said, by the way, Alan, that this was Chapter 2, Seattle was Chapter 1, Chapter 3 is the Republican Convention in Philadelphia. So I think we're going to revisit all of this in just a few months.
And even bigger than Chapter 3, they're really aiming at that Democratic convention in Los Angeles, and that's one of the things that really frightens Democrats here and that could have some effect on that critical vote on China trade that Congress is going to have to make next month.
Well, you've made my segue for me. Thanks very much, Alan, because coming next, we will talk about China trade and the race for the White House. We'll have Representative David Bonyer of Michigan, who is also, of course, House Minority Whip. And still later, rain didn't stop the protesters from flooding Washington, D.C. streets. An update on the World Bank protests from the mayor, Anthony Williams.
On the next Hardball, he's one of the greatest generation, and he knows how rough the race for the White House can be. We'll talk to former Republican presidential candidate Bob Dole tonight at 7 Eastern on MSNBC.
It was America's worst prison riot. From the standoff to the aftermath, what really happened in the deadly rebellion of Attica? Crime Files, tonight at 8 on MSNBC.
It's like growing, and it itches. I get that. You do? Yeah, Beth got me a cream, though. Cleared it right up. What's it called? I can't remember.
Hey, Beth! Beth! What? What's that itch cream called?
What itch cream?
Tim's got that itch I had.
That's a Vino anti-itch cream. It's on our list of basics that I ordered from drugstore.com. You need more?
Everyday basics, pharmacy, and more at drugstore.com.
Make sure to put his glass in the dishwasher.
Where's your glass?
Hey, what's new?
New is doing new things in new ways. It's a way of thinking and working to create innovative data, internet, and voice communication solutions for businesses around the world. New is visionary, practical, and the only way to approach technology in today's fast-changing marketplace.
Oh.
RSLCom, doing new things in new ways.
So what's new?
Jeff and Jerry, Jerry and Jeff,
right,
are identical twins, so you'd think their price for term life insurance would be identical.
No way.
That's because your life insurance price is purely personal, based on things like your height, weight, health history, even hobbies.
I smoke a cigar occasionally. I like to scuba dive.
To an insurance company, that makes Jeff and Jerry two distinct people with two distinct prices.
The secret to saving money is finding the right company out of hundreds with the best price for me, and the one with the best price for me.
Select Quote to the rescue. Simply call toll-free or click on SelectQuote.com, and Select Quote will match you with your best buy from the pick of over 1,700 life insurance companies.
Then you can buy your policy from home and never see a salesperson.
Take a tip from Jeff and, Jerry and Jeff. For one-of-a-kind savings on term life insurance, call toll-free or click on SelectQuote.com.
Welcome back. Joining us now from Detroit, Representative David Bonyer of Michigan, who is, of course, also the Minority Whip. Welcome.
Nice to be with you, Andrew.
What did you think of today's protests? Did they make the point, or did they get a little bit off message?
Well, I think it's important that people be able to come to the nation's capital and peacefully protest in this country. It's in our tradition. It's happened here since the founding of the nation, and it's an important part of our democratic traditions. I think it's important that they do it in a respectful and a peaceful manner. And I think the issues that they're addressing are very important ones. The questions of being able to come and participate at the table on some of the most important questions that we have as a country and as a world community. It's important also to be able to deal with debt questions and especially for developing countries. And these are important questions. For the most part, Andrea, they have been peaceful. Last Sunday, not yesterday, but a week from Sunday, there was a peaceful demonstration to relieve debt for developing nations. And of course, last Wednesday, we had upwards to 15 to 20,000 folks come here from the labor community, the faith community, and the environmental community to protest the China trade deal that we will vote on eventually. So most of the effort here has been respectful and peaceful, but some of it has gotten out of hand, and we don't condone violence of any sort.
Congressman, isn't it true that there has never been economic growth in any country without this kind of globalization? That globalization is essential to improving the economies of underdeveloped countries and third world countries.
Of course, isolation is never the answer to a strong economy, and it's important for countries to trade with each other. The question is, under which rules are we going to trade and who is going to benefit? And that's what this debate over China is all about. We want to make sure that people in other countries have the ability, like we have here, to come together, to organize, to collectively bargain, to address questions of child labor and slave labor. Those are fundamental labor core issues that we care about. In China, though, Andrea, what you have is a brutal police state, an authoritarian regime, which if you try to organize in that fashion, you will end up in prison or in jail. If you try to organize politically and form a challenge to the existing political structure there, you will end up in jail. If you try to form a religion that is not sanctioned by the existing government, you will end up in prison.
Does that mean we should just close the door to them at the risk of cutting our trade, cutting things that are very important to American lives, American workers who benefit from jobs that are created by trading with China?
Of course we shouldn't close our doors to them, and we have a relationship with China and we talk to them, but that does not mean that we ought to sanction and support and reward them for this kind of action with most favored trade status. We should continue to trade with them, but we should make it clear to them that these values that we care very much about, that our founding fathers strove for, and that people actually bled for, went to prison for, and protested for in this country 100 years ago, have some meaning.
And but Congressman, they're going to get into the World Trade Organization with or without us. They've got the votes now from the rest of the world. So if they're going to be in there, which will force them to abide by standard rules that are now imposed on all members of the World Trade Organization, isn't it in our best interest to be at the table and to have more say over the conditions for their entry?
Good question. Well, two things there. Number one, first of all, they have not concluded an agreement with the European community yet. So we don't know what the agreement is going to be that affects us with respect to Europe's negotiation with China. Secondly, the Chinese have virtually violated in a serious way every trade agreement we've negotiated with them. And I think all you have to do is look at intellectual property, your business, videos, tapes, and that kind of thing. You go to China, 98% of that stuff is pirated. People don't get the credit and the compensation that they deserve. They don't follow the rules. They don't have an enforcement mechanism and an administrative mechanism to make it work.
Well, let me ask you about the politics of all of this. Are you willing to risk some very close races with incumbent Democrats who are willing to support the trade deal, who will then not get support from organized labor and could lose to Republicans? You have a chance of regaining the House and you being not just the minority whip, but the majority whip.
No, majority leader, Andrea.
Majority leader, excuse me.
So, of course, I don't want us to lose.
Which is more important, China trade or retaking the House and becoming majority leader?
I think they're both important, and I think they're both compatible with each other. And I think this debate is a healthy debate, and we will go forward no matter what happens in the vote. But we think fighting for the values of a clean environment, for worker and job protections, and as well as for human rights is worth fighting for.
And briefly, are you upset with Al Gore for joining Bill Clinton in endorsing this trade agreement?
No, Al Gore has a certain role to play as the vice president. Of course, he has said on occasion, most recently...
Well, he's not hesitant to split with Bill Clinton when he wants to.
Well, he did say in New Orleans that if he was the president, in the core agreement with China and other trade agreements, he would have these labor, environmental, and human right protections. And I'm looking forward to defeating this proposal, and then when he's president, going forward with a plan that will protect workers and environmental community.
Okay. Thank you very much, David Bonner, the man who wants to be majority leader after November. Thanks for joining us. And up next, IMF meetings go on as scheduled. Who gets the credit, Mother Nature or D.C. police? D.C. Mayor Anthony Williams is here. We'll talk to him next.
Violent tornadoes, surprise snowstorms. What's causing the wild extremes in the nation's weather? On the news with Brian Williams tonight at 9 on MSNBC. This sexy genie was full of tricks and treats.
I loved doing it. That kept things really interesting.
But pressures on the set and tragedies at home almost cost her her magic.
It was just something I couldn't believe was happening.
The strength of supernatural siren Barbara Eden. Headliners and Legends, tonight at 10 on MSNBC.
Take it easy. You're at Ramada. Take a few laps. Have a few laughs. Save a few bucks. With Ramada's bed and breakfast getaways, you'll save big on deluxe accommodations, plus get a free breakfast for two, now through May 25th. For reservations, call 1-800-2-RAMADA.
Imagine combining the stain-fighting power of Efferdent and freshening power of Listerine. You'd get Efferdent Plus. It's extra fresh, and nothing gets your dentures cleaner. Efferdent Clean, Listerine Fresh. That's Efferdent Plus.
Once there was a princess whose love for butter was doomed by wicked cholesterol. No one could wake her until...
I can't believe it's not butter.
I can't believe it's not butter!
The taste you love without the cholesterol.
It's been a very long week here in D.C. Protests started a week ago and grew daily, culminating in a mass demonstration outside the World Bank today. Washington, D.C. Mayor Anthony Williams deployed the peacekeepers, and he's here with an update. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for being here.
Pleasure to be with you, Andrea.
Well, you've been out on the streets. What is your take on whether your people either used too much force or too little force, or how it all went?
I think that our people showed great poise and discipline and professionalism in a very difficult situation. I think they used just the right amount of force. Great numbers in terms of force, but very measured and prudent response in different incidents and transactions as they occurred. So I think our people did a very good job.
Mr. Mayor, there were pictures and certainly video, still photos in the newspapers, video on television of people being beaten and pushed back. And those, I know our own producers have told me and our reporters in the field, were isolated incidents. But that certainly is the more dramatic video, and that is causing concern that the police may have used a little bit too much force.
Again, I think that you've got to look at this into the broad sweep of everything, from the planning of all of this all the way through its execution. And yes, you're going to have incidents, and yes, there's going to be a proper time to review individual incidents. But again, in the vast majority of cases, by and large, overall, I think our policemen under very difficult situations, federal forces as well, I think showed incredible discipline. You have demonstrators who are out here to make sure that this meeting doesn't happen, that are using very sophisticated methods to probe these lines, taunt these policemen who've been up days and days and days. You're going to have incidents like this, and certainly where they occur, none of us tolerate that. But if you look at the broad sweep of this, and again, the discretion and judgment that these officers showed from the police chief on down, I think it was wonderful.
Just want to say a word about the police chief. I think it was very interesting to see the kind of leadership where he was out there without riot gear on himself, making some of the arrests and leading his men. It seemed to have a good effect on the men and women in the police force. Plus, he was talking to the protesters. There seemed to be an effort to keep dialogue going from both sides.
Absolutely, and I think that was the chief's personal effort to do what he was doing throughout this entire episode, and that is be proactive, be preventive, keep tempers low, do everything you can to diffuse the situation so we don't end up with endless sprays of tear gas and, a major fracas.
Are you regretful that tear gas was used at all? Because it was used in a couple of instances. I don't know whether by the Metropolitan Police or the Federal or the National Guard forces.
I think, again, in very limited episodes, again, in a very limited way, I think that's to be expected. Yeah.
What have we learned from these protests? What have other cities learned from you now? You learned from Seattle, clearly. What advice would you give to Philadelphia for the Republican convention, Los Angeles for the Democratic convention?
You can never start planning too far in advance. You've got to use all the resources at your disposal, including intelligence. Your response has to be appropriate for the conditions. You want to have a high degree of response in terms of number of people, but a low degree of response in terms of the tactics that you use. If you under-respond in terms of people, you're forced to use heavier-handed tactics. I think that was a lesson here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mayor Anthony Williams from Washington, D.C. And that's all for today. A short news break, then equal time. I'm Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, Washington.
This sexy genie was full of tricks and treats, but tragedies at home almost cost her magic. The strength of supernatural siren Barbara Eden. Headliners and Legends, tonight at 10 on MSNBC.